Rochester is located in the northwest of New York State, on the southern shore of Lake Ontario. It is the third largest city in the state and is known for its distinct four seasons and its title as the Flower City due to its remarkable beauty. In the past, Rochester was home to Kodak, the largest employer in the area. However, with the rise of digital technology since 2005, Kodak has been surpassed by the University of Rochester and its affiliates. The event discussed today is related to both of these institutions. On February 19, 1982, in the Brighton area of Rochester, a man called the police to report that his neighbor's wife had been murdered in their home. The police quickly arrived at the home of James and Catherine in Brighton and witnessed a horrific scene. Catherine Krauseneck, 29, was found on the bed, covered in blood, with an axe embedded in her head. According to the coroner, this was the fatal blow that caused Catherine's immediate death. James Krauseneck told the police that he found his wife's body after returning home from work. Their 3.5-year-old daughter, Sarah, was there, with her hair in disarray but unhurt. A few minutes later, James carried Sarah to a neighbor's house, where the neighbor called the police. The neighbor recounted that James, holding his daughter, stood silently unable to speak. Lieutenant Bill Farrard of the Brighton Police took statements from James and Sarah. James, still in shock, said he had left for work at around 6:30 a.m. as usual and returned home after 6 p.m. to find his wife had been murdered. Sarah appeared confused about what had happened. The little girl said she had seen a bad man sleeping on her parents' bed with an axe over his head. When asked about the man's skin color, Sarah replied, "Many colors." However, Farrard speculated that Sarah might have been confused and that the bad man she saw was likely her mother, lying on the blood-soaked bed. Though Sarah couldn't provide any useful information, the fact that she was at the scene without injury left people puzzled. The first investigation team at the scene found no fingerprints, fabric fibers, or any other important forensic evidence. In 1982, DNA was not yet used in investigations. The crime scene was fairly messy. Catherine's wallet was on the floor with its contents scattered around. A window pane in the bathroom was broken, and a hammer was leaning against the nearby wall. In the dining room, several valuable items were left on the table, and a set of silverware was neatly arranged on the floor. All of this suggested a robbery, but many details seemed unusual. There was no sign of a typical robbery. Nothing appeared to be taken. The axe in Catherine's head and the hammer were both household items. Cash and valuables were still in plain sight. A black plastic bag nearby had faint footprints, as if someone had stepped on it or had previously placed a pair of shoes inside. The shoes were found next to the bed in the bedroom, but they were flimsy and unsuitable for February weather. Brighton police acknowledged that murders were rare in this area, though thefts were not uncommon. However, based on their experience, they believed this was not a robbery, but rather a staged crime scene to cover up the real crime, Catherine's murder. As is typical in cases where a wife is killed, suspicion quickly fell on the husband, James. James Krauseneck was an economist at Eastman Kodak at the time. He had previously taught at Lynchburg College in Virginia and the University of Rochester. James' father and uncle ran a carpet shop in Mount Clemens, Michigan. Catherine Krauseneck was born in Detroit and was the second youngest of 6 siblings. Her father had been a truck driver, worked for a concrete delivery company, and later opened his own historical company. James and Catherine grew up in the same small town in Michigan, just across from each other on opposite sides of the railroad tracks. They had known each other since high school, but only started dating in college. They married in 1974 in Mount Clemens and moved to Brighton, Rochester in 1981 due to James's job. Friends and family described them as a happy couple. In 1978, they had Sarah while James was studying for his economics degree in Colorado. He was thrilled when their daughter was born. However, when the police searched the couple's car, they found a small book on marriage counseling, which led them to suspect that their relationship was not as perfect as it appeared. The police visited Kodak for an investigation and discovered that James had used a fake degree to get his job. He claimed to have a PhD in economics, but in reality, he had not completed his thesis. After the case, even though James had agreed to meet with the police, he failed to appear. His parents came from Michigan, took James and Sarah, and left Brighton less than 24 hours after Catherine's murder. When the police tracked down James at his home in Michigan, he agreed to speak with them, providing hair and blood samples, and hired an attorney 10 days later. The core issue was whether James was home when the crime occurred. He claimed to have left the house at 6:30 a.m., but due to the limitations of forensic science in 1982, the time of death was only estimated to be between 4:30 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. There was no direct evidence against James or a clear motive, and both the police and prosecutors were hesitant to take the case to court, causing the investigation to stall. James and Sarah later moved to Seattle. In the following 20 years, James remarried twice briefly before meeting Sharon, his current wife, in 1997 at a trade show. They dated for 2 years and married in 1999, living happily in Seattle. James shared the story of Catherine's death with Sharon, but did not go into detail. Sharon trusted her husband and did not want to bring up the past, as it upset James. In 2015, the FBI proposed to help states review unsolved cases. The Brighton police requested the reopening of this case. After reviewing the evidence, they still considered James the primary suspect. In April 2016, 2 detectives from Brighton traveled to James's home in Seattle. James remained calm, did not call a lawyer, and said, "I hope you bring good news." They had a long conversation, hinting that they knew who had killed Catherine in an attempt to get James to confess, but he firmly stated, "I didn't kill my wife." Sharon also believed in her husband's innocence, thinking his reaction was normal. After failing to get a breakthrough from James, 2 months later, the police sent the evidence to the FBI lab for DNA testing using new technology. The results showed that there was no DNA from any unknown person at the crime scene, only traces of James, further strengthening the suspicion that no one else had entered the house that night. This became the most damaging evidence against James up to that point, although it was still indirect. To prove that James was the killer, the prosecutor needed to determine the exact time of Catherine's death. With the technology available in 1982, the time was only narrowed down to between 4:30 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. In 2018, they consulted Dr. Michael Baden, a renowned forensic expert. Based on the old analysis, Baden concluded that Catherine died around 3:30 a.m., several hours before James left for work, with reasonable medical certainty. If correct, combined with the staged crime scene, the police believe James was the perpetrator. James Krauseneck was indicted on November 1st, 2019, but the trial was delayed until 2022 for special reasons. In court, James, now 67, still denied the crime. The prosecutor pointed out that before the murder, James had faced trouble at Kodak when the company discovered he did not have the PhD he had claimed, putting his job at risk. If Catherine had found out, a conflict could have arisen, providing a motive for James to act. The defense lawyer countered by arguing that the police only focused on James and did not consider other possibilities, calling it a narrow viewpoint. They challenged Baden's conclusion, offering the opinion of forensic expert Maloney, who suggested that Catherine might have died later, around 1:30 p.m., contradicting Baden's findings. James's lawyer also mentioned another suspect, Edward Larrabee, a convicted sex offender who had confessed to being Catherine's killer while in prison. At the time, Larrabee lived half a mile from James' house. However, the prosecutor argued that Larrabee's confession was unreliable because it didn't match the crime scene details. He even got the color of Catherine's hair wrong. He described it as black when she had blonde hair. Larrabee, a notorious criminal, had murdered another person after being released from prison in 1991, and had a history of confessing to crimes in exchange for benefits when he was nearing death due to illness. Although the case was reviewed after 40 years, there was no strong new evidence, only Baden's opinion, which wasn't entirely certain. The final decision rested with the jury. Sharon, awaiting the verdict, told the press that she feared for her family's future. By Friday evening, the jury had not yet reached a decision. On November 14th, 2022, they concluded that James Krauseneck was guilty of second-degree murder. In his final statement in court, James insisted, "I did not kill Catherine. I loved her with all my heart." But the judge was unmoved and sentenced James, then 71 years old, to 25 years in prison. After the verdict, Sarah told the press that she was lucky to have great parents, but the person who killed her mother was still free, and her father had been taken away by a failed justice system, wrongly convicted. In contrast, Sarah's grandfather, Catherine's father, expressed satisfaction with the result and told James, "I hope you live to 100 to enjoy your new home." Sarah still believed her father was innocent, feeling the verdict was completely unreasonable.